What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. We're continuing on with the Euros match analysis. We're going to be looking at France versus Germany today. And before we start, please check out my book. It's online, it's on Amazon, and be sure to check out Keyframe. That's how I'm making all these videos. All those links are in the description below, so be sure to check that out. But let's get right into it. So as we see here, the France build-up structure in their first third of the field is highlighted here. The center backs are divided by the goalkeeper, and their shape is very narrow centrally, with a lot of overloads in the half spaces to then narrow the Germany defense and create space for their fullbacks to then progress the ball easily through wide areas and then continue progression from there. So how Germany lined up to try to counteract this is they played with a 5-2-3, but Germany stayed very narrow because of the occupation of their central three players in their last line of attack of France, and with their threats in 1v1 situations, the Germany side stayed very compact with the inverted wingers of France, and then the midfielders as well staying very narrow. And to prevent numerical inferiority happening from the German point of view, we had the central striker drop on the holding midfielder, and then the two holding midfielders of Germany would then pick up the more advanced players of France. But their wingers were too far off of it, and they could not control both the central defender and the fullback, and this was true for either side, and this just gave them a lot of space in the wide areas to then progress through. Now we see in the second half the same build-up structure of France, with their goalkeeper coming between two central defenders, a lone pivot with a number 8 and then a clear 10, and all these players playing in the central three corridors, with then the three forwards occupying very narrow positions to then either create 1v1 situations or isolate themselves to then use their pace or just their individual quality. And then this would really open up the wide areas for the fullbacks, and as we see here, if a wingback does jump and they can't establish numerical superiority on one side, then they look to the weak side, which is almost always vacated, and then they can have an outlet through. Now moving into the midfield third for France in possession of the ball, they built now with a back four, and what this did is the four defenders stayed quite deep and used the full width of the field, as we see the weak side players just coming into a bit more interior part of the wide structure, and the wide structure in this picture is actually divided quite well with just the grass and how it's cut. So if we look at the grass, divided the wide area into two different vertical channels, as Nagelsmann usually does. We see both the winger and now the fullback are in the inside part of the wide corridor, and on the strong side he's using the full width of the field. We still have relatively narrow wingers and a central forward, now creating an overload between defenders, giving Germany more to worry about. And then the same structure holds true for the France midfield three, and now creating a single pivot with then two more versatile advanced players able to then combine with the front three and use the half space to try and progress the ball. And this was really to match up 3 versus 3 against Germany's midfield, and having three more narrow forwards, they were able to use their on-ball qualities or their pace in behind and into dangerous spaces as well. Now France, another variation of their midfield third offensive phase is when they go with dual width, so they leave their wingers wider now, and now this is more to stretch the German side horizontally or progress through these wider areas that are relatively vacated against the 5-2-3 German side. So depending on the situation, if France is able to pull Germany a little more horizontally and create spaces between the lines, they would then progress through the lines, or if Germany stayed horizontally compact, then the space would be there to use the dual width and then provide some movement in the wide area in a lower density space, allowing the players to use more of their individual qualities on the ball and their pace. So France was able to establish qualitative superiority in the wide areas while keeping it relatively simple in terms of a 4-3-3 and their squad roles within the team when they were playing. Now with Germany in possession of the ball here, they built out of the back with their back five, with their wing backs playing wider and 3 central players occupying each of the central corridors. Now one interesting thing was now with the player Toni Kroos as the left-sided defensive midfielder, and you can see they're slightly off-centered here, the double pivot, and this was on purpose, and this was a trend throughout the match. So we often saw Toni Kroos dropping into the left half space and actually coming into the first line of build-up, playing almost creating a back four, or the 3 central defenders would then shift over, so the right weak-sided central defender would go into the wider area, and the other two would compensate for this, allowing Toni Kroos to get on the ball deeper outside of the France's block and in the left half space. Another key aspect of the German side in possession is their variability in their positioning with their front three players, and then with Toni Kroos dropping deeper, then the positional changes of the German side with Toni Kroos dropping deeper, sometimes they felt like they lacked dangerous options between the lines, and then they lacked access to these spaces in general with so many players coming outside of the France's block. I felt they didn't have a lot of great options for progression, and France countered this pretty well with their 4-3-3, which soon became a 4-5-1 with a little bit of asymmetry in their defensive movement. So the strong side wide midfielder would drop and join the midfield three, creating 4, and then the weak side wide midfielder would then play slightly higher up the field when they would go deeper. So it would be an off-centered 4-5-1, but often would look like an asymmetric 4-4-2. So here we are, there are 3 central defenders for Germany, and we have Toni Kroos in the left half space alongside his double pivot, who's occupying more of a central role. We have our 3 front players who are playing very high up the field, thus not giving themselves a lot of space between the lines, and oftentimes when Toni Kroos would drop this, it would be an attempt to try and pull out France's defensive player, but it didn't work out that way, and France were more than happy to stick to their compact block. So as we see here, the only real players between the lines are the double pivot of Germany. The front 3 are more stretching, creating height, and the wingbacks are creating width. So there's not a lot of options between the lines in the half space. In the half spaces between the lines, just behind the outside central midfielders as the interior players. So now another mid-block shape here from France is 4-3-3 against the 5-2-3 of Germany. And now this is one way that Germany could establish a route to progress the ball through the wide areas with all their central options with their double pivot. Toni Kroos now starting to favor the deeper half space outside of the opposing team's block, trying to get on the ball and potentially pull the France players out of position to then create space in more dangerous areas. Didn't work out like that, but that was the intention, and with Toni Kroos' range of passing, we also saw a few long diagonals from Germany, isolating players in the wide area, but France's shape was never really changed, thus it became ineffective. Although it was a good switch of play, they weren't able to establish superiority with these actions. Also, the wide central midfielders of France, as we have highlighted here, these 2 players played extremely well in using their cover shadows and positioning themselves between the central defenders, thus creating a high level of spatial control between the lines, as we see here, between cover shadows and just the use of compactness principles to then limit any influence of the German attacking midfielders or narrow wingers, however you want to call them, between the lines in the half space, and gave France a high level of control in these areas. Now the last concept with Germany in possession, their overload and isolate principle, and here we have with the wide central defender and one of the most central defender coming into the half space, thus creating asymmetry and pulling over the France's defensive shape, creating an overload on this right side. We have this huge occupation of German players, which forces France to then shift over their team almost onto one side of the field, which then creates an isolation or a vacant free player in the wide area, which they can circulate through their numerical superiority and find their free player. And this was down to the double pivot, the asymmetric shifting of the back 3 in possession of the ball, and then their front 3 playing very narrow and their wing back staying wide as well. So a few different things happening here, but what it comes down to is using the overload and isolate principle in the game to then create the weak side as the route to progress the ball. So that's the video, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.